One of the most conspicuous ways that nations flex their economic muscle is by spending vast sums of money on space exploration. The amount of dollars allocated to space programs by nations like the US can be measured in the trillions, when it's arguably the single most wasteful expenditure of the nation's budget. Aside from the opulent waste, space exploration can also be described as psychopathic. After all, what could be more sinister than devoting such enormous resources on something of no practical value for the average citizen, rather than allotting that money to the more noble tasks of, for instance, feeding the hungry or housing the poor? But since a spirit of international competition is characteristic of authoritarian regimes, the governments of the world are engaged in a constant race to outdo one another in extravagant spending, and space exploration allows them to fulfill their lust for conspicuous consumption unlike any other activity. One example of this was the infamous space race between the Soviet Union and the United States in the 1960s. Communist Russia was determined to cement its leadership position on this front by sponsoring the first manned space mission, prompting America's government to respond with its own attempt at interstellar supremacy. In 1966, the popular aerospace writer Lloyd Milan consulted dozens of the nation's top photography and aeronautics experts to analyze, frame by frame, the entirety of the photographic evidence of Russia's alleged first manned space launch. His findings were summarized in a special feature published in 1966 by Science and Mechanics magazine entitled Russia's Space Hoax: Documented Proof that the Soviet Space Program Has Been Faked. Among some of Milan's more startling conclusions was his claim that the famous photos of cosmonaut Leonov's alleged spacewalk were clearly the result of photographic fakery. Consider the picture seen here of Leonov as he emerges from his capsule with a helmet visor that clearly shows his face. This photo would later be retouched to show a much darker visor consistent with those used by American astronauts, and which would certainly be required to shield against the intense solar radiation of space. Note also the artificial-looking background of Leonov's supposed spacewalk when compared with the first American spacewalk of astronaut Ed White. Milan further drew attention to the deep contrast between shadow and light in the Ed White photo compared with the Leonov photo, which showed only bright light with no shadow, which is consistent with having been filmed in a studio. Additionally, White's helmet visor showed the reflection of a celestial body consistent with a star in the distance. By contrast, Leonov's visor showed what can only be described as the reflection of a studio light. Other photographic anomalies in Russia's first spacewalk include what is supposed to be Leonov emerging from his capsule. But as the photo suggests, this was actually taken in what appears to be an underwater diving tank, since what appears to be bubbles are visible in the background. Moreover, at no time during Leonov's spacewalk was the entire body of the cosmonaut visible, but rather only parts of his body appeared at any given time. But for astronaut Ed White, his entire body was seen in the pictures and videos at all times, since no fakery was necessary. Even more startling was the apparent use of a wire used in the Russian spacewalk photos to create the illusion of levitation in space. No such contrivances were in evidence for White's spacewalk. Finally, photos of Russia's Space Command Center during the Leonov mission were shown to contain what can only be described as a primitive switchboard equipment, compared with the far more sophisticated electronics used by NASA's ground control during White's mission. My point here is not to argue the superiority of America's 1960s space program versus Russia's space endeavors. Rather, it's to illustrate the point that authoritarian structures like communism must resort to such lying propaganda in order to advance their claims to supremacy. And the reason is that communism, by its very nature, undermines the profit motive, which makes such high-level technological achievements possible. This explains the Potemkin village-style fakery that is so pervasive in Sovietized economies. But more troubling is recent evidence that suggests America is well on its way to following Soviet Russia's example. Consider the recent failings of aerospace giant Boeing, which had enormous trouble this year launching a basic 1960s type rocket. Or consider the high profile failing of Boeing's 737 MAX airplane. As critic James Lindsay noted in a recent YouTube video, the once mighty Boeing's corporate board has been taken over by woke Marxists in recent years, which explains the shift away from quality and aerospace excellence in favor of ideological purity. Then there was Elon Musk's highly publicized attempt at launching a Tesla car into space a few years ago. Shown here is what was advertised as an actual photo of the event, which appears to be anything but legitimate. As Elon himself tweeted, quote, "You can tell it's real because it looks so fake." All of this should serve as a warning for any nation to avoid the temptation to embrace the tyranny of communism. For a nation that prides itself in its technological excellence has everything to lose and nothing to gain from rejecting the ideological source of its achievements, and it will surely walk away with nothing to show for it. This has been South Bay. Thanks for listening.